Hello everybody and welcome to Canyonlands National Park. We are at a beautiful viewpoint called Dead Horse Point. When you look down, you understand why it's a scary name like that. I can imagine somebody hundreds of years ago coming up here on horseback and thinking, man, how am I going to get around this giant canyon? Honestly, it looks like a mini version of the Grand Canyon. It's hard to register scale, depth, or anything because it's just so vast. And that gives me an opportunity to do something very interesting here. I've been messing with my other camera views and different millimeter lenses, and I can't seem to find a way to frame in the magnitude of this scene in a still single image. So what I'm actually going to do is do a multi-row panoramic image because one, it's a huge panoramic vista already, and two, there is a massive amount of detail. There's a road down there, the Colorado River, all these little mountains and rocks down here. I want to be able to get everything in this landscape into a single stitched image. I think that's going to be the best way to capture the magnitude and mass of this incredible location. If you've watched any of our previous tutorials, you've seen me do panoramic images before, but today I want to do something completely different, and that's blend a panoramic image using moments in time. In other words, I'm going to take a couple panoramic images and then blend pieces of them together. Now, in order to do that, I'm going to have to use a special piece of gear that includes index rotation. Now, cleverly enough, to get index rotation, you need an index rotator. Let's get right into the way this is set up. Just like every other panoramic gimbal image that I've been working on, I made sure that the tripod is level. I've used the micron level here on the nodal slide to make sure that that's perfectly level. And I've made sure that everything rotates properly. This index rotator has a couple different plungers. These are actually called plunger knobs. On the left here, and remember you can orient it any way you want, but currently on the left, the large plunger, if I tighten that down all the way, it stops all of the rotation. If I loosen up a little bit, that engages the index rotation, so it just allows me to move it. So when you're transporting this, you basically lock this down. When you open it up like this, you're allowed to basically move the panoramic image across, just like that. It's pretty simple. What's special about this, and I'm just going to turn it towards the camera so we can see, what's really special are these plunger knobs. You get two knobs and the main plunger here, and on the end of the knob here is a little spring-loaded ball bearing. When this makes full contact, in other words, when you plug this in all the way, it will determine at what points and what degrees of rotation this stops on. If I rotate this around all the way, right now it's set, this one's turned all the way at 10 degrees, and that one's tightened, this other one's just loosened so it's not engaged. So when this one's tightened down, it's going to rotate every 10 degrees, which is exactly what I want. If I were to loosen 10 degrees, just go ahead and turn this a little bit. If I were to loosen 10 degrees, I could actually change it all the way down to 30 or 90 degrees. I can say 15, 20, 24, 30, and even 35 degrees. So if I were to turn this one in here, I can basically get a larger degree of rotation. This level of control goes to really small degrees of rotation all the way up to very large degrees of rotation. Now to determine that, you kind of need to know the field of view of your camera. Now remember the rule of thumb for panoramic images and stitching them properly is 1/3 overlap on each image. So right now I'm shooting at 50 millimeters, so 10 degrees seems to give me a comfort zone of that 1/3 overlap. But if I was shooting somewhere between 14 and 24 millimeter, I could probably get away with somewhere between 30 to 45 degrees of rotation. So it's all going to depend on what lens you're using and how wide that lens happens to be. The other reason I'm using this is it's a really good example of a very popular piece of panoramic equipment that's used by a lot of professional photographers. It's actually called a Nodal Ninja, and it's made by Fanotech. So it's a very popular rig that a lot of people rely on. If you're planning to do a single row panoramic image or a multi-row panoramic image, it's not really important for you to have an index rotator. Yes, it does help. It speeds up the process, but you can pretty much just eyeball it. As long as you have a basic 1/3 overlap per image, you should be able to get everything to stitch properly. That being said, if you're planning on blending different panoramic images together throughout the duration of your shoot, you're going to need more precision because you're going to have to stitch these panoramic images together and then blend. So if one time you were a little bit off, let's say your degrees were off from pano 1 to pano 2, there's a chance that those are not going to stitch the same. So the mountain could be a little bit left or a little bit up, even by a few pixels. If the geometry inside of that panoramic image is off, then you're going to have seams when you start to blend. Especially if you think about layering one image over another and changing the opacity. If all of the edges and lines of the road, of the mountains are off, then you're obviously going to have issues. Having this level of control over the rotation, stopping at every index point, allows you to shoot each panoramic tile in each panorama the same exact way, which gives you a much better chance for success when you're in stitching and then finally in blending. So this panoramic image in total is going to have 4 rows of 12 images. So that's going to be a massive panoramic image at 50 millimeter when it's all stitched together. This is the Nikon D810, so those are 36 megapixels a pop. Now with this lens, I could shoot it at 24 millimeters and then I'd only need 1 or 2 rows of images. But since I'm shooting this at 50 millimeter with multiple rows, I'm zoomed in and the end result is going to be so massive. The file is going to be so big that I'm going to be able to zoom in on some infinite detail. So the more you zoom in to create a panoramic image, the more you're going to be able to see all of those tiny little details in the background. Is it more difficult to stitch? Of course. Is it more difficult to shoot? Yes. Does it take up more file space? Of course. Is it going to make your computer shed tears of blood? Probably, but you're going to get a beautiful image. So I've talked about the panoramic gimbal settings. Now let me just cover some quick settings in camera. I'm shooting at f8. I've already set the focus, locked the focus in manual. I'm shooting 3 exposure brackets, -2, -1, and 0. Looking at the scene, since we started talking earlier, the sky has kind of dissipated, so I'm going to cut 1 row out of this panoramic image because there's nothing really to capture in the sky. I'm going to capture my level horizon that includes part of the sky, and then I'm going to do my other panels on the bottom. So let me go ahead and get started doing that now because I'm starting to lose the light. So everything's ready to go. I'm also using my trigger release cable, so I'll go ahead and start shooting these now. All right, it's like a typewriter effect. So I've done that once. I'm going to go all the way back over. And now I'm going to rotate down 7.5 degrees. Click that into place. Just like a typewriter, I'm going to do it one more time. Something else to point out, I'm using really fast SD cards. So as I do this with bracketing, I'm shooting pretty quick. I never hit my camera's buffer or the max write speed. So I never get a delay in shooting. While the sun was setting, I captured 2 panoramic sequences. My intention was to capture the sun just as it started to go behind the cloud line, which was really lucky for a scene like this because with the sun up in the sky, it's incredibly hard to shoot into the sun and it causes glare on this environment. But my hope was that I could capture the last soft light on this landscape, and I think I was able to achieve that. As the sun starts to set more, the color in the sky is going to increase, and I'm hoping for really nice colors in the sky. But as that happens, my foreground is going to get worse as far as lighting goes. It's going to get darker and darker and darker. So the whole goal with this is to wait a little bit longer. I might shoot 2 more panos, 1 more as it starts to get a little darker out, and then 1 final sequence once the sky starts lighting up with color. All right, light's looking pretty good. Sun hasn't set all the way, but I'm starting to get a little bit of color, and that sun is going to disappear behind the black clouds. So this seems like a great opportunity for me to get the last panoramic sequence before the final one at sunset. So I'm going to go ahead and set up to do that again. It's very windy out here, so what I'm also doing is every time that I rotate it, I'll take these shots. When I rotate it and it clicks in, I give it about 2 seconds now for it to settle because it'll wobble for a second before I take the shots. With wind like this, it's also important to have a stable tripod like this one. And just to make sure during a wind gust, wait it out. If you get a big wind gust, just wait a second before you take the next shot. All right, that's row number 1. Time to reset the typewriter. Rotate it down. Go 1 more time. And that basically completes the final row. I don't know if I'm going to get any more color in the sky, but I'm going to stay here just a little bit longer. If the color starts to get a little bit better, if it changes, I'm going to shoot an additional row just to capture the sky to see if we can use it. But this is pretty much complete. I've been able to capture pretty much everything that I'm going to need, or at least I hope everything I'm going to need. So the next time I see you guys, we're going to take all this into post-processing, we're going to work through any potential issues, and we're going to blend multiple panoramic images together. Hello everybody, and welcome back to the post-processing studio. It's time to actually start editing the nightmare that was the panoramic shoot at Dead Horse Point. Why was this a panoramic nightmare? Well, one, I was shooting directly into the sun, which means that my exposures were all over the place. But it wasn't just because of the sun, it was also because I was shooting in aperture priority mode. So the discrepancy of shooting into the sun, the brightness of the background, the darkness of the foreground, every exposure was all over the place. That being said, what I was able to capture when I looked at it inside of Lightroom, when the sun was actually above the horizon, there was no way I was able to get the values for the sky. So in the field, I decided that I would shoot the base panoramic image during golden hour. Then I would continuously shoot just the sky in hopes that since I was using a index rotator, in other words, that everyone was going to be fairly consistent, every single one of those panels that I shot, that theoretically I should be able to take a pano from early, or at least from golden hour, and a pano from sunset, and then blend those together seamlessly. At least that's my hope. So let's take a look at Lightroom and I'll explain exactly what I have for you guys here. So I have one row here on the bottom. So this is the bottom row, and you can see how nicely that's exposed. The foreground looks incredible. There's some people here. Some crazy guy put his GFX 50S right near the edge and left it there. I don't know who's that crazy, but we'll figure that out in a minute. The other thing is, here is the sky. So let's take a look at these consecutively, back to back. So the sky pano and the ground pano. So can you see a difference in the exposure? Yeah, quite a bit. This is way underexposed, so we could get this back, but we actually are losing a lot in the foreground. So even if I were to correct this, we're actually getting some light in the foreground that I like. Even here, we're getting some light here, some light on the mountains, and most importantly, well, more light. So we know that this one's going to come out better, but we're not going to be able to get the sky back. And we know this one in the foreground's not going to come out great, but at least we have and can maintain somewhat of a sky. Full disclosure, I think this deserves a reshoot, but we only had one day there to shoot. So rather than just toss this lesson to the side, I decided to try to put this back together, see if there's something we can salvage, and more importantly, see if it's possible if we can blend a portion of a pano from one point in time with a portion of a pano from a different one. So let's figure out the timestamp first. That's what I want to look at. If we look at this image here and this image here, I go to the library panel, I scroll down. Now, I'm notoriously bad for not updating my time zone, so I must have been in Southeast Asia or Japan, somewhere like that, because I wasn't shooting at 3:26 a.m. But if we look at 3:26 became 3:48. So basically 22 minutes difference from the sun being up in the sky to the sun setting. So 20 minutes is not an extraordinary amount of time, but it's just enough to where we lost the light in the foreground. First things first, let's go ahead and select every single one of these raw files, and I will deselect the panel result here. Let's go ahead and go up to Photo Merge, and let's see what Lightroom does by default. Let's check out the result here together in the preview window. So while it seems to have stitched fairly well, it's also really dark. So Lightroom prioritized the darker scene and sort of got rid of all of this. So this is near black. I mean, this is going to be so far into the shadows that if I adjust it, it's going to be incredibly noisy. So let's do something that we haven't done before. Instead of treating this as one pano, let's treat it as two. So what I'm actually going to do is treat this as two separate panos and then put them together. So this one is the result of all these together. So I basically went up here, same thing, Photo Merge, Panorama, and I left it on spherical. The other thing that's really important is I made sure to not boundary warp. And you can see that the result here, you can see it stitching it together, but it's not pulling those edges. That's because I want to blend them together. So this pano, as a whole, does not require much color correction at all. It's almost perfect in the foreground. In fact, it may need to roll back a little bit to have a little bit of contrast. This other one, however, if we look at this other panoramic image, you can see that this one, just like the result we got when we put them all together, requires a tremendous amount of color correction, both in the sky to pull those highlights down and then in the foreground. So this one's going to have a lot of heavy lifting to get it to match the bottom. Now, thankfully, if we look at it, most of the detail and most of the things that we're concerned about in this panoramic image or the final result is going to be the foreground. So if we don't have to edit this very far, we know that when we zoom in, we're going to get all that crisp detail that we're looking for. The reason you shoot a pano in the first place, you want all of that detail so we could print this or just display it super large. Whereas this other one, we're going to have to make a lot of changes. But predominantly, most of the pano is going to be from about here down on this image, and from here, just really the top and up. So we can push this a little bit farther. So let's tweak this a little bit and treat it as two different panoramic images, and then we're going to try to blend these two panoramic images together into one seamless, larger pano. So let's start by adjusting the sky portion of the pano, and you can see this needs a lot of work. So let's start with a fairly aggressive 3/4 of a stop, so 0.75. We'll pick that back up by bringing the highlights back around the same amount, 75. Let's try to get that right at -75, and let's just ramp those shadows right up. So far, we've lost some of the contrast, but we're getting close. But let's take it a little bit further and add a selective mask for the sky. So we're just going to fairly keep that right along the horizon and fairly tight there. We'll go ahead and reset it manually. Let's try -0.5, so half a stop. Let's ramp those shadows up, and that's just going to get rid of that vignetting on the edge. And let's cool it off a little bit. Maybe 20 points in that direction looks pretty good. Now let's create another mask just for the foreground. So we'll just go ahead and shift and create one just for the foreground here. Another fairly tight gradation from the foreground to the background. Just get this just right while I can actually see what's going on here. So let's just go ahead and take this up another additional 0.25 here. And let's also bring the shadows up just a little bit here in the foreground, also about 25. And let's examine the result here. So that looks pretty good. Let's look at the two together, because this is really where it's going to make the difference. Are those two going to be able to blend into each other? And so far, I think they're going to work pretty well. They're fairly balanced. So now with both selected, right-click, export. Let me just double-check my settings here. So we want to definitely go back to the temp folder, which I had before. And I was working on something previously, so let's reset this back to our normal things here. PSD, ProPhoto, 16-bit, and of course, afterwards, open in Adobe Photoshop CC. So far, so good. Let's go ahead and select all, copy, close this guy down. It's going to take an extra second because it's a pano, and paste. So now I have these two. So I know it's going to be really difficult to align them manually. So what I'm actually going to do is select both of these layers, go up to Edit, Auto Align Layers. This time I'm going to set it to auto, but also I'm going to enable geometric distortion. So I didn't do that when I treated these as two individual panos inside of Lightroom, but now that we want to merge these two panoramic images together, it's a good idea to let it go ahead and distort some of these edges just in case something's sort of bent on the horizon. And we'll say OK and see what happens. And if we check out the result, not too bad. Not too bad overall. We can kind of see where this is coming into play here. If I really kind of turn this on and off, it's not exact. I'm not going to lie, it's not exact, but it's close. It's actually really close. And you can see we have some issues. So what I'm actually going to do here in order to blend these two things together, I'll go ahead and zoom this out. Let's name these first. Let's call this Pano Lower and Pano Upper. Now instead of creating a mask on this layer, what I'm going to do is just marquee select with this tool here. And if I want to move this, when I do any marquee selection, I can move it by holding spacebar. Basically just going to drag this to the edge, and I want to figure out the area first. So I'm going to drag this to the area that I think, you know what, I want to keep or blend from this point to this point, maintaining over here. I want to go ahead and keep all of the foreground here of this selfie spot and the crazy GFX camera sitting on the edge. I want to keep all that from the bottom, but I want to keep some of this on the top. And when I click Create New Layer, with the selection active, it's just going to go ahead and crop that out. So obviously that's not exactly what I want. But now, with that being done, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And with this mask here, I'm going to go into the mask options, and I'm going to feather it. So I'm going to do this manually, just feathering this. Rather than drawing a gradation, I'm going to look at it and determine how much feathering to use. And it's starting to look pretty good. Pretty seamless here. So right around 350 to 380 pixels. We'll just go ahead and keep that around 350. So now, if I zoom this out and just do a top before and after, it looks pretty good. Now obviously we're going to have some issues. This is where the pano's not really going to line up. And this is where you actually have to decide. Some of the detail in the background isn't sharp already because it's in the background. So what we can actually do now is go in and clean some of this up. So right now, we kind of have a little bit of double vision going on here, and I don't like that. So I want to clean that up, and I want to find edges. What I can actually do is start to paint some of that out, really simply. So we have some of it here, we're seeing some of that effect, and I can just go ahead and with a black paintbrush just paint that out. So we'll continue to paint. Zoom out a little bit, don't need to be that far in there. We'll just close that brush down a little bit and just kind of paint out some of this midground, just this midground here, and sort of follow this edge. I'll even turn that all the way up to 100%. Now we have to remember when we're painting on this, it's already a really soft mask because I'm using the feathering. So the brush is going to be extremely subtle already because it's just using the softness that's applied now to that mask. So globally, it's always going to be soft no matter what. So that looks pretty good. Now, I think we have that pretty well cleaned up. Just make sure that we have that. We have some of this. Let's get rid of some of that right there too. And we'll back that up and we'll just take a look. So before and after, not too bad. We've actually combined two different panos from different points in time together. Is it perfect? No. But if somebody really zooms in on it, they may notice. So that's why we've isolated the overlap to the background, which is already a little bit more softer than the foreground. Anyway, so chances are nobody's actually going to see these little overlaps or anything like that. It's actually going to be fairly seamless when you walk up to it if you print it large or wall size. Obviously, if you post this to social media, Instagram, Facebook, or anything like that, nobody's ever going to see any of that detail, that little nuance in the background, so you have nothing to worry about. Now it's time to address the distracting objects. Obviously, I do like the GFX 50S. Fujifilm makes a nice camera, but it's got to go. Let's see if Content Aware can solve it. Maybe. Not too bad. Let's follow that up with a light-handed brush, the clone stamp here, just to fill in some of that texture. That's actually pretty good. Let's try our luck twice. Let's see if we can Content Aware this photographer out of frame. Not really. I'm going to try one more time. Nope, not really. Let's go ahead and get rid of this guy the old-fashioned way, and that's going to be with the clone stamp. Now this is really easy to do, a lot easier once you do it a few times, but essentially what I'm doing is just looking for edges. So see this edge of the rock moves in across here. All I'm going to do is grab this edge and continue that same edge here. Pretty easy, pretty straightforward, so we can just continue that edge. Same thing here, that looks very similar. That side of the rock looks very similar. Same thing here, we have all of these parallel lines. Just pick some of the parallel lines and just go for it. Because trust me, this guy is way more distracting to your final image than this and what you're doing. Even if you make little mistakes here, nobody's really going to notice. If you leave that guy in there, he's going to become front and center, sort of the main attraction of your image, which you do not want. So we'll just go ahead and clean this up a little bit. And again, this is easy. See this edge here? Let's bring that edge up, paint that down. Paint that down. Fairly straightforward. These guys are going to be a little bit more difficult. We're going to start by addressing the easy parts, which is this edge. Follow that along to here. And we can just really quickly tie those two edges together of this landscape. Paint some of that in. And I know the road's off, not exactly straight, so I can just go ahead and fix that road. Just like that. Same thing here. Follow it up one more time. We'll just go ahead and get rid of the rest of him. Sorry guys, you are not making the final edits. With the rock, follow the rock here, and same thing. We'll just recreate how we see fit right here. Pretty simple. See this edge right down here, this point? Let's create another rock point. Whoops, let me try that one more time. Grab this edge here. Let's go ahead and come out right about here. And there's another sharp edge of the rock. Really easy. This guy, even easier than the last one because he's sitting right in this landscape. Really simple. Same thing, follow the road. The road, follow the road. I just start singing while I'm doing post-processing. Sorry, guys. I'm not really good at singing. But sometimes, if you're doing this for hours, I recommend listening to music. You guys just get to listen to my voice as I do this. I have a lot of Apple Music playlists that keep me sane throughout this entire process. So we're really close. I don't like that repeating pattern up there. I mean, I'm really getting into some nitty-gritty details here, but I like everything to be as nice as possible moving forward. And I like this edge right here. I'm just going to go ahead and sort of terminate the edge of that rock just so it looks good. Let's back that up a bit. I don't think there's going to be anybody in the infinite landscape or in the water back there, so we don't have much to worry about there. So now what I want to do is create a new layer out of everything. Shift, Option, Command, E. Well, I'll get a new fresh layer here. Perfect. Let's call this Blended Pano. And we'll just name this object, OBJ removal. Remember, you guys will have all of these files too, so you can go back and check the work later. Now it's time to address something that I really don't like, and that's the sky. But to be fair, I like this part of the sky. I'm just not a huge fan of this part. This is where the sun went down. I feel like this looks kind of messy and just not great. So what I'm actually going to do is manipulate the sky a little bit and change the dynamic of this pano. And I'm going to do that first by selecting the sky itself, which is going to be just about here, right above the horizon of the landscape. Forget top of the mountain there, just to the top of this mountain. And I'm going to Command J, which is going to create a new layer. And it's going to create a new layer based on my selection. So you can see that I have just this layer independently. Now, if I do Command T for transform, I can stretch this up. So now at least I can extend those clouds further up in the sky so I don't have that negative space. I don't have to go too far, just a little bit, just like that. And it's going to change the dynamic of the sky. And you can see before and after. Now I'm going to merge down. So Command E will take this layer, merge it into the blended pano. And it keeps the name blended pano, which is also convenient. Now what I'm going to do is something a little bit sneaky, and that's stretch the sky. So I know I like this portion of the sky, so what I'm actually going to do is just above that mountain, I'm going to do the same thing, Command J. I'm going to zoom out a little bit, Command T for transform, and I'm actually just going to stretch this sky all the way across. Just like that. And we'll hit Enter. And we'll take a look, and obviously it's got some issues, so we'll create a mask here and just follow that edge. So you can see that edge very clear with a gradient from white to black or black to white. In this case, from black to white. So from here to here, I'm just going to fade that out. And we're not going to really see that edge anymore of that sky. And I'll zoom out a little bit. And that looks pretty convincing. I don't like the way that this looks. I feel like that cloud needs to fade in. So with the brush and a low flow, I'll actually paint a little bit of that out. So we don't want the red, just so that these clouds kind of work together and look a little bit more believable and realistic, just so there's not a sharp line. Same thing here on this side. I'll just go ahead and paint some of that out just so it works together. And that looks pretty good. So let's go ahead and make this full screen and take a look. Well, it's actually quite a bit nicer, I think, because this was a big dead spot in the sky. I really feel like there's not really anything interesting there. Now we have something that looks a little bit more dynamic. And again, I don't love the sky, but this is a little bit better than it was before. Once again, let's go ahead and merge this down. Now that we have everything blended together, Sky's a little bit tweaked. Let's see if we can bring some life back to this image. I'm going to go ahead and Command J to duplicate this, and we're going to call this ACRF. I need to use this Adobe Camera Raw filter up here to try to pop some of the details in the foreground. I think we're going to be able to make it really dramatic. So let's go up to the Camera Raw filter real quick. First of all, ignore this line up here. When I crop things, I don't delete crop pixels. In a similar fashion, when I stretch things beyond my composition or beyond the bounding box of my PSD, it's still there. It doesn't actually delete it. So this is just showing past what we're actually going to crop to. So don't worry about this strip of sky. Let's be concerned with everything underneath. The first thing I want to do is add some contrast. So let's add some contrast. Let's add some dehaze. And we'll add some dehaze too. Dehaze is really nice. It's going to really pull the foreground and background together. And let's also warm this thing up. I feel like it needs to be a little bit warmer overall. I mean, it is the Southwest, so it should be a little bit warmer. Now let's concentrate just on the foreground, and let's warm it up even more. Yeah, that's starting to look right. Let's also dehaze a little bit more too. Let's add another 10 to 15 on dehaze. Let's also adjust the whites. And as I adjust the whites, you can see that it's brightening this whole area up. So let's bring that to about 50, just to bring that back. I feel like I pulled the highlights and the whites out of the sky so much that it pulled too much out of the foreground. So that'll help mitigate that a little bit. I'm also going to adjust the gradient itself. I don't want to make the sky too warm, so let's go ahead and do something just like that. Now let's double up and do a gradient for the sky as well. It's going to remember the last settings that I had, which is not what I want. So let's go ahead and reset those settings really quick. First thing is I want to bring the temperature down. I want that to be a bluer sky, so maybe minus 15. Let's also make it a little bit purple. We'll go positive 15. So this is going to tint it a little bit into the magenta and the more saturated blue look that I like. Let's also roll back the highlights a little bit, just a little bit, and also the whites, just a tiny little bit. Now something that I'm noticing as well, I feel like this area is a little bit too dark, these areas where it's blended. So let's fix that. Let's create a wide ellipse, just like this. Obviously, we're going to need to reset those settings first. And let's try something. Let's just crank those shadows up. Well, that works pretty well. But let's also bring the blacks up a little bit too. Nice. That's exactly what I want to do. So that just mitigated those dark lines that we had at the top of the mountains there. I think I need to roll the blacks back just a little bit. I think that's a little bit too much. But with the shadows up all the way, that's more than enough to compensate for those dark edges. Let's go and apply the result. That's not too bad. I actually like it. It feels warmer. This feels really cool, very flat, and this is starting to have some more life. So very quickly, this is turning into a very usable panoramic image. But let's take it a little bit further. And the reason is I feel like I need to adjust some contrast and I need to adjust some of the tonality, some of the shadows, while keeping the highlights intact. So we can always do that very easily by using the channel palette and doing a little bit of luminosity masking. So let's start by holding the Command key and clicking the RGB channel. Once that loads, click on the Make New Mask button. We end up with Alpha 1. Command D will deselect. I'm going to name this Highlights. And the reason is everything white or mostly white is going to be selected once I turn this into a mask. Everything black is going to be knocked out. So right now the highlights are selected. If I want to create a shadows, I can just duplicate this by dragging it to the Make New Layer, inverting it with a Command I, and obviously renaming it Shadows. So shadows is pretty cool. You can see there are way more shadows than there are highlights in this image, but it also knock out certain areas. For example, look how bright the river is, parts of the sky, and everything else. So this is kind of nice. Basically what I want to do is here, with a curves layer, what I want to do is actually bring up the intensity of the entire image. So a big boost just like this. But if I do that, you can see that I'm actually blowing out these areas. The more I do this, the more I'm going to blow out those highlights. So that's not what I want. So if I go back here to the channels, I can actually load the shadows by command clicking it here. And in the layers here, I can actually go to curves and apply curves. And when I select to create curves, it's automatically going to apply this as a mask, which is really convenient. So right now, all of the shadows are selected. Some of the highlights are not selected. So if I adjust this, and I start cranking this up, even if I take it all the way, you can see that those highlights, it looks a little ridiculous, are still intact. And now you can see how much of this image just fell into the shadow range. So I can start to easily start to bring the brightness of the entire image up. And what I'm trying to do is find that edge where I don't start to clip any values. That is value there. There are some highlights and some midtones. So if I start to go past that, I'll clip them. So I want to be a little bit subtle on it, just like this. Now the next thing, now that I've brought the luminosity up on the image, the next thing I want to do is go back to the channels, and I'm going to create a midtone mask. So midtone masks are really cool. It's a combination of what's left when you subtract both the highlights and shadows. So if I select all, for example, Command A, it's going to select everything. It's just like drawing a big square marquee over the entire image. And now, if I hold Command and Option, I can subtract the highlights. And if I subtract the highlights, I can also subtract the shadows. And when I subtract the shadows, go ahead and click on the OK button. When I create a new mask here, you can see that I get alpha 1. Well, alpha 1 is actually what's left over. So if I had everything and I remove the highlights and I remove the shadows, if you think about it this way, removing the highlights, removing the shadows, what's left when you take all that away? Just what's in the middle, or the midtones. A midtones luminosity mask is useful for a bunch of different purposes. But right now what I want to use it for is to create a little bit of dynamic contrast. Now, if you're new to luminosity masking, I know this is just a few lessons into Photographing the World 4, but trust me, we're going to be using them a lot. I'll do my best to explain them step by step so that by the end of this tutorial, you have mastered luminosity masking in a manual way. In other words, you will never need a third-party application or plugin to do your luminosity masking for you. So if you're not used to the midtone mask, and let's go ahead and name that right now, midtones, don't worry because we're going to be using it a lot in future lessons. So with this, you can see that we have the highlights, the shadows, and the midtones. The midtones looks really flat, which is fine. When we load it, it's basically going to tell you that it can't show the selection, which is fine. If we go back to layers and do the same thing, apply a curves layer, you can see that it's going to go ahead and apply that anyway. So even though it doesn't load it as a visible selection, it'll still apply it to a curves layer, which is really nice. So we have here, we have our curves where we've bumped the gamma, protected the highlights. Here we have the midtones. Now the midtones are just this part of the image. And don't worry if you don't see it here in the curves. If I boost this, you can see it's really going to shift the middle. That's not really what I want to do. Now, truth be told, most of this image does fall inside of the midtones. So what I'm actually going to do is add a little bit of dynamic contrast. I'm going to do that by darkening the dark portions of the midtones. And you can see here I'm getting some more rich color and detail here. And then I'm also going to increase the highlights of the midtones too. So this is sort of a micro selection within the histogram itself. So rather than having the shadows and the highlights being manipulated by my contrast, this is actually only adding contrast in the midtones, and it's effectively spreading out those midtones. So here I can actually find a really nice balance between here and here. And if I feel like it's getting too dark or too light, I can always make the adjustment here. So this is going to be my overall gamma with the highlights protected, and I can pick that up, put it exactly where I want it. Here in the curves is actually going to be the midtones contrast. So we're going to call this gamma, and we're going to call this tonal contrast, which is pretty cool. And the other thing too, if you really don't like the way it's doing certain things to the image, like right now I love it, but I don't like how it's really making this hot, I can actually do the brush just a little bit here, and I can paint that out. Because it is a mask, I can just go ahead and paint that out really easily so it doesn't affect that part of the image, and we can just balance it just to where we like it and tweak in between. Another thing we can do is add one more layer, brightness and contrast, and we can just add a little bit more contrast, just like this. And the contrast is just going to occur, and that's about 20% of a gradient here. We're going to say it's going to be from the top of the sky to about the bottom of the sky here. So this is just going to be additional contrast. We'll say additional contrast. Just like that. Now let's take a look at everything we've done to this image. Let's head back to Lightroom first. First thing we did, we stitched two panos. While this bottom one did not need much editing at all, the one on the top for the sky actually needed some aggressive editing just to balance it back. Once we did that, we brought everything into Photoshop and we started with the lower pano and then we put the upper part in and blended that together. After that, we removed those annoying objects to the left, blended the whole thing together, manipulated the sky. Then we used the Adobe Camera Raw filter to give it a little bit more life and color balance, and we added a few luminosity masks and a contrast adjustment to really bring it all together. So it's not going to be a true before and after. I think the best thing we can do is go from here, which is the combined panoramic image, to what we had at the end. After all of our adjustments and manipulation of the sky, we went from here to here. Now obviously we've pushed things pretty far. It's starting to look pretty good. Last thing we'll have to do though is make sure that we crop out those annoying white edges there. So we want to make sure that we crop in just like that. And when I hit enter again, you can see that everything outside is still going to be there later, just in case I cropped too much. Overall, I think this has been a great lesson because we've been able to, one, do something different. We took two different panoramic rows from different points in time, one that was exposed well and one that was exposed horribly because of the backlight. We were able to stitch those together, adjust one, then in Photoshop we were actually able to seamlessly blend those together, give a little bit more life to the sky, and come out with something that's definitely salvageable. But my favorite thing about this is we realize now that it's possible. I can actually go into the field, and if I have an index rotator, I'm going to get greater accuracy of panos if I have consistent panos that I'm shooting. So now, to be honest, let's talk about the image. I'm not in love with the image. I think it's definitely better than I expected, but the way to really solve this image is a total reshoot. So if I had more time out west, I would have definitely tried to get a beautiful sunset. I feel like this shot with a late afternoon, the golden hour coming into the valley, plus a beautiful fiery sky in the background could be something really magical, truly unique, and definitely you'd be able to see the enormity and the vastness of this place by using the panoramic process just like this. So all that being said, I think it was a great lesson. I think it's an okay image, and if I had time, I'd definitely invest another shooting session. But we can't do that this time, but we've definitely learned a lot. So next time I see you guys, we'll be back in the field capturing more of the American Southwest.